Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read along podcast. The Wheel of Time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
That is your host, Greg, who somehow still knows very little about the Wheel of Time, even though he usually pretends otherwise.
And that is Tylor, our resident expert, who makes sure you know how much he knows about the Wheel of Time.
It's a lot. Join us each week as we continue our journey through Robert Jordan's great fantasy epic, exploring the books, the television show, ill-advised discussions of visual media on a non-visual podcast, and so much more. Although actually not, it's just that.
Yes, all that and actually nothing else as we travel on, and I know what this means now, through the glass columns.
Yeah, he really doesn't know all that much.
No, you don't know that much.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I, of course, am Tylor, your host with the most pauses while I figure out whether I'm allowed to say something. And I am joined by Greg, who also is really good at things, most of which don't involve pausing for 30 seconds and evaluating their life and their podcast choices. Greg, how are you feeling about these chapters where you can say a lot more than I can because there was some foreshadowing this week?
Interesting. I was gonna say, I'm good at a lot of things, most of which aren't involved with this podcast. But hey, I will do my best to keep up with you and continue on. Hey, it's Dream World for half of this week. And
Yeah.
I won't say it was, the best nor the worst. I was just kind of along for the float, but it did feel like a big deal that we get our characters caught up to us in terms of the world around them and kind of lose that bit of dramatic irony we've been celebrating throughout the book so far. But I'm excited to talk about these and see where they're going, and I will avoid commenting on the second chapter in case people are listening to this having just read the first half of this chapter. But, big picture, we're moving, right? We were stuck in the mud for a week because we had our technical issues that meant I haven't gotten to read new chapters in a while. But we're already, I'm almost at page 300 in my 900 book, so that sounds like a third to me.
Yeah, we are getting along in this book, y'all. I have notes in my outline of what weeks we're doing things, and we are getting close to a couple of those little stars. Get excited. This week, of course, we are talking about Chapter 15, What Can Be Learned in Dreams, and Chapter 16, An Unexpected Offer, and it sounded like Greg was basically done with his intro, so I am now going to immediately dive into a summary of Chapter 15, What Can Be Learned in Dreams. Nynaeve is unable to move to the Amyrlin study when she focuses on it, but after realizing that she may not know it well enough, she is able to travel to the study of the Mistress of Novices. As soon as she arrives, she realizes she has some very bad memories here, because it turns out she's not a very good accepted, and so she gets punished a decent amount, and she thinks that no Aes Sedai has intentionally been in the world of dreams since Corianin, but even despite this, she decides to change her dress to an accepted dress, and out of caution, disguises herself to look like Melaine. As she is walking through the tower, she briefly sees Elida in a 6-color stole rather than the traditional 7-color stole, and she is yelling that she is the Amyrlin. As Nynaeve enters the newly decorated Amyrlin study, she opens the door and an accepted dress addresses her, and then immediately morphs into Egwene, who is chiding Nynaeve for using Melaine's face. Nynaeve starts asking if Egwene has been allowed in Teleron Riode by the Wise Ones, but Egwene cuts her off, chiding her for the risk of being in Teleron Riode untrained. Nynaeve tries to assert herself, but is repeatedly cut off by Egwene, who eventually says that only Elaine should use the ring because Nynaeve ignores all advice and warnings about how dangerous Teleron Riode is. Nynaeve is shocked by Egwene kind of dressing her down, but then Egwene creates a nightmare of 2 men who lift her off the ground and clearly are planning to potentially rape her. I wrote ick in my notes. Not a good look for Egwene. Egwene eventually makes the 2 men disappear, and then Egwene says she didn't hold them here at all, so Nynaeve could have dismissed them if they were Nynaeve had been able to. Nynaeve then changes her tack, noting that the room does not look like Suan, and Egwene recognizes the painting of Bonwyn, while Nynaeve says she worries that Suan has turned against Rand because of the other painting. Nynaeve is upset when Egwene takes charge of the search, but realizes there's nothing she can really argue about, and so she goes to a desk and finds a box of documents, but the documents disappear and go back into the box as soon as they are picked up, so she's only able to read brief pieces of them. We learn, for example, that the Grand Marshal of Saldia is missing and that there are no reports from Tanchico. We also learn the Aes Sedai think it's absurd that Pedron Nial is taking credit for diffusing tensions, but we also know from other parts of the book that is actually what is happening. At this point, Egwene shouts, and she learns that Elida is the Amerlin now. The group speculates on what could have happened to Siwan, and Egwene apparently learns that Moraine is wanted now, and this makes more sense now that we know that Elida is Emerlin, and they deduce that Elida will not support Rand. They also realize that the Ajas must have split, and Egwene praises Nynaeve for seeing that the Ajas has split, and Nynaeve is almost surprised at how happy she is at that approval. Nynaeve then realizes she probably read where the blues are in a note, but she can't seem to remember it, and then Nynaeve spends some time recognizing the change in her dynamic with Egwene, and it now seems that Egwene has kind of moved to be the more senior and more in charge, as opposed to Nynaeve, who traditionally has had that role. Nynaeve admits her lie to Egwene and says that Tom and Julian saved them from the Fork Root, and then she threatens Egwene not to tell the Wise Ones about this. Egwene only smiles and says that she suspected as much, and says that Nynaeve always puts her best face on things, and Nynaeve denies things even to herself. Nynaeve tries to deny this, but at this point Egwene brings up the one time that she lied to Nynaeve, and Nynaeve made her drink a horrible mixture, and she conjures some of it in the world of dreams. At this point, Nynaeve admits that she does exaggerate many times, but says it wasn't that bad, and Egwene dismisses the concoction. Egwene immediately moves on to who to tell about what is going on with the Amerlin. She notes Rand and Moraine needs to know, but also says that she shouldn't tell all of the Aiel, and so Egwene tells Nynaeve not to tell the Wise Ones about this visit. Egwene says that Nynaeve's temper is the root of all of her other issues, and she needs to get a hold of it, and Nynaeve is tasked with remembering where the blues are, and they depart, while Nynaeve thinks about how odd things are, and how she should have said many things differently to take control of the conversation with Egwene. At this point, we switch into Egwene's POV, and she wakes, afraid the Wise Ones have learned that she goes into Teleron Riod alone, but none of them are there. Egwene says that she only goes into Teleron Riod as when the Wise Ones want her to, or when there is something important, and so she thinks it is justified. We also learn that she learned a lesson from her conversation with Nynaeve, and apparently she is happy that she has learned an effective way to manage her, and she realizes that she is doing it largely by acting like an Aes Sedai. She then dresses and approaches Rand's tent, and she asks one of the maidens whether he is sleeping. They say he is not, and Avienda is outside and is grumpy. Apparently he is keeping her awake because he does not want her in the tent while he discusses prophecy with Jason Natale. Egwene briefly looks into the tent and sees that that is what is going on, and then she makes her way to Moraine's tent. She senses channeling there and thinks that Lan is sleeping, but then when she looks back, he is immediately awake. It turns out that Moraine is using the power to eavesdrop on Rand and Jason Natale, and then at this point, Egwene tells Moraine that Elida is the Amerlin. She basically, Moraine gives her the excuse. I need to stop using the word she in my notes. It's very confusing. Moraine basically suggests that it could have been Egwene's dreaming, and she latches onto this, that the Wise Ones will not ask where the information comes from. She then thinks of many of the images that she has had in her dreams. I'm sure we'll talk about those in a little bit. And then, very notably, Egwene gives a really good Egwene answer when Moraine asks how she knows. Moraine accepts that answer, and then she says that she has no time for tears, despite the fact that she is very close to Suan, and she notes that it has been 21 years that they have been working in secret, and sometimes you simply have to pay the price for the things that you do. Egwene notes that there is hope in the resistance against Elida, but Moraine seems more terrified by a splintered tower than actually accepting of the idea that the resistance is a good thing. Moraine seems unworried about Rand being controlled by the tower unless there are 13 sisters all controlling him simultaneously. And then at this point, Egwene warns Moraine that the Forsaken are plotting, but Moraine notes that Lanfear is mentioned and then says with luck they will have no worries of Lanfear soon. Everyone seems to disapprove of Moraine and Lan's interaction, but Moraine says that she is willing to do it because she has learned the lesson that she did as a novice, that in order to control Saidar, you must surrender to it. As Egwene walks away, she realizes that Moraine treated her as an equal for the entire conversation, and also realizes that she may be much closer than she expects to choosing her own Aja. That's a long-ass summary, and I'm allowed to say ass. It's allowed in PG-13 movies. Greg, what did you think of this chapter? That, yes, it was a dream chapter, but not really much dreamy happened in it other than being able to spy without being noticed.
Yeah, I mean, as I alluded to in my opening comments, I think this was an important chapter, and it does feel like Robert Jordan waited the correct amount of time to have the characters catch up with the readers so that we got to enjoy it for a long time, but I think that was going to wear thin quickly. So it felt really good that not only did Nynaeve and Elaine, most importantly, or, kind of, the most pressingly, got the true situation. We also now got it spread all the way to Egwene and Moraine. And so, so I love all that. I would say my frustration is I'm kind of getting sick of these female characters and the way they're written at where they just like all kind of jockey with each other, right? There's a joke. Oh, this is such a deep cut. In the Family Guy edition of the Star Wars movies, when Mon Mothma shows up in Return of the Jedi, Lois, who has played Princess Leia, is like, "Oh my God, another woman! I hate her." And like, it's a dumb joke, but it's it's like, oh, there's only 2 women in the galaxy. Of course, they have to hate each other. But it does feel like a good commentary on how men tend to write women, that they are presented as kind of catty and infighting in ways that, in my lived experience, women often aren't. It's usually the dudes who are having a pissing contest and trying to determine who's going to save the galaxy. So I find myself tiring of that, and why that dynamic is interesting, because we get a lot of that between Nynaeve and Egwene, and then we really get it wiped clean out in the Aiel Waste, where it's like, oh, but it's not going to happen between Moraine and Egwene anymore. They're just going to be equals now in this partnership to try to get things done. So, that's not me letting Robert Jordan off the hook, but it's me saying like, okay, maybe we'll see the end of that kind of stress too.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned before in this series there are 3 or 4 moments that I more or less completely black out until the next time I read the series and then remember it. And in early, maybe like 2 or 3 pages into this chapter, I was like, oh, I remember what's going to come next. Gross. This has always been one of my least favorite scenes in the entire series, right? I think it is moderately believable that Egwene would be frustrated and kind of outside of herself enough to pick something to punish Nynaeve that is way too far, but boy, is it way too far, and I don't know that it does anything productive for the relationship, right? The second half of the conversation where Nynaeve conjures the where Egwene conjures the horrible concoction, I think that did what we needed to happen, and not only did we not need all of the extra cattiness, we certainly didn't need the implied rape threat for no reason.
Yeah, seconded on that, and thrown in the mix too, not as offensively, but randomly, was like, and I used to pat her bum just 2 years ago. And I was like, when she was like 16, I was like, that doesn't seem right to your age range. And because of the grossness, feels like a male fantasy again or some such. So, but all of that aside, other than that, the play was great, Mr. Lincoln, right? But there's really helpful, interesting things here. And I do like how it slowly got revealed. I think when Nynaeve makes the joke, like she sees Elida and says like, "Oh, that would be her dream," ha ha ha, like not
Yeah.
yet clicking. I was a little worried that that was all we were gonna get, and it's like, oh no, we've got the full picture now. Plus, looking at some of the correspondence that clarifies for the characters what was going on before, and also the big threat that lies ahead, and that makes me more hopeful that this book will involve that conflict, because I think if it slowly simmered, I'd think it was playing the long game for future books. I'm not saying I think they will solve this and all will be right in the White Tower by the end of the book, but they're at least going to work on advancing this plot.
Yeah, I think what's so frustrating about this chapter is that it is so much really great stuff wrapped around this kind of like just bad character dynamic that we really need to end sooner than later. I think the thing that really stood out to me at the beginning of this chapter, kind of in regard to what you're describing, how much kind of it moved the plot forward and kind of advanced us kind of towards something new, is I thought that this was a really great chapter for showing how much Egwene has changed, right? She is acting like a wise one in this chapter. Essentially, the way that she treats Nynaeve is exactly the way that we have seen wise ones treat their apprentices, right down to the fact that, like, more or less corporal punishment is the norm. But also, Egwene is kind of really mature in this conversation. Every time Nynaeve apologizes for it, Egwene drops it and moves on to something completely different and never brings it up again. That feels very Giotto to me.
And it goes back to also the fact that Egwene is here for mature reasons. She could sense Nynaeve was going to kind of push the limits and make some dangerous choices, so came to protect and stop her or make it as safe as possible. And that, again, I don't think that fits into Giotto, but it does show that Egwene has significantly leveled up. And I do think Nynaeve has matured more than this chapter would make you believe, but this does feel like a moment of weakness for her and a moment of strength for Egwene kind of throughout, other than the threat, like you said.
I think this is the chapter that really makes me want to go back and reevaluate the chapter we had maybe 2 weeks ago where Nynaeve was just being a horrible person in the carriage for the entire chapter. And there's a part of me that wants to compare what Nynaeve actually says in this chapter to what she said in the carriage. And I wonder if she comes across just as badly if you're not in her head thinking all of the time she knows that she's wrong. Right? It's easy to read this chapter, and I think Egwene comes off as the villain a little bit, just because, you know, the horrible things she does. But I wonder if you are in Egwene's head, if this chapter reads very, very differently in the first half.
I do not want to go record that chapter for a third time. We're not going back. We're no more. But it is an interesting question of how. You know, the phrase unreliable narrator is so in fashion. I'm kind of sick of it. But the idea that, you know, when we're in these narrators' perspectives, you know, we should be thinking of the warp that puts on a given set of events. And I'm actually doing this with my students are writing narratives right now, and I'm talking to them a lot about, like, we forget that a narrator shouldn't just be this omniscient voice who's never defined, but that we should see their impact on what we're getting presented. And how much you want to play with that is up to you. But if it's not a kind of third person omniscient, if it's one of your actual characters, that you have to remember to characterize that person. Mm-hmm. And so I think that when I read Game of Thrones, and it's been a little while, I always felt like there was no real reason why it was first-person perspective that shifted around, other than we got to get to all the different groups of characters. Whereas I think Robert Jordan has demonstrated a bit more willingness to play. And the kind of play you're talking about, I don't know that I've fully seen, but I'm interested in kind of interpreting if I have seen it, it's been growing over time, and I'm interested in him pushing those limits a little more and playing with it a little more.
He's gonna. I guess that's all I can really say. In terms of the remainder of the Nynaeve POV section, we already know so much of what the girls learn here that I think it's kind of their reaction in the next chapter that is maybe more interesting than the actual knowledge they get. Do you have anything else in your notes before we switch into Egwene's POV? I think I'm pretty tapped out.
I would just say, and it was in your summary, I thought it was striking that not like it's hard to know how quickly the Aes Sedai institution is going to reform. So the fact that she's already wearing a stole with 6 colors instead of 7, it's like
Yeah.
not just is she not so keen on the blues, but they're being written out of the institution seems like extreme and quickly. And I think there are historical real world examples of things like that, like the excommunication of a sect within a larger group. And then it's just like, oh, the blue I mean, gosh, I don't want to make light of our real world bigotry that we see in our presidential campaign, among other places. But like you can see when you dehumanize a group, that means you can pass whatever policies you want. And it's like, yeah, let's instantly wipe them out from the stole. And then we can say they are all traitors and should be hunted down. And everybody just goes along with it. Obviously, real world examples are much more upsetting and much more important than silly book examples. But it is a dynamic we have seen historically work among institutions and crowds of people. So it's a little startling that it's that far along already in fantasy world here.
It is worth noting, we've talked before about the White Tower as kind of feeling very like big and institutional. Robert Jordan has made it clear that he kind of modeled a lot of the kind of visuals, at least the descriptions of the architecture, for example, of the White Tower, that was modeled after the Catholic Church. And so what we have here, if you're talking about kind of historical precedent, this feels to me a lot like kind of, I think it was the Middle Ages when we had a split in the Vatican where there was one pope in the Vatican and another pope in Avignon in the south of France, and they were basically competing with one another for which one was the legitimate Catholic Church. That's kind of, I think, the historical narrative that Robert Jordan is borrowing on and then expanding with this. And I think you're right to say he's doing a really good job of drawing kind of what that looks like and how quickly institutions try to alter themselves in order to make it clear that they think they are the legitimate one of the two.
Yeah. I was going to make a joke about the movie Two Popes, which was kind of terrible, but somehow got nominated for a bunch of Oscars. But it's two different popes.
Movie.
It is two different popes. It's a different time there was 2 popes. So, and also there was young pope, and this fall we have conclave. So popes are just fun to talk about, but
so hot
that
right
makes
now.
sense to me. And then I was thinking a little bit about like I'm not the best scholar of the Catholic Church, but when the Church of England split off, it was kind of like, yep, they're just totally separate now, and now we're 400 years later, and it's like those are totally different traditions. So that makes me, because this is a series concerned with deep time, what does the Blue Aja look like in 400 years? Or are they returned to the fold? Can they be triumphant if Moraine and Suan somehow get back? It's feeling less likely that they... Well, and this will be our transition to the next bit, I'm sure, but it feels less likely that they will retake the Aes Sedai Tar Valon institution, and it's feeling even more like they don't want to. That is not what they're going to, that's not the cost they want to pay. They don't want to take those actions.
Interesting. While Greg is working on his long-term projections, I want to jump into probably half a page of text that Greg got nothing out of the first time, and I am going to make him get something out of it the second time. That's right. Egwene has a whole bunch of dreams, and she describes them. A few things are mentioned here. Rand sitting down in a chair, and somehow Egwene knows that the chair's owner would be murderously angry at having her chair taken. Note the pronoun there. That the owner was a woman was as much as she could pick out of that, and not a thing more. Any idea whose chair Rand might be sitting in and why she would be mad?
I mean, Tar Valon comes to mind, and a man claiming ownership of the White Tower would be pretty crazy.
That would be wild. Perrin, lounging with Fael on his lap.
Sorry. Shh. Or Andor, right? We also know that we have some conflict there, and we have a powerful queen sitting on a throne who is being currently kind of reshaped by the influence of a Forsaken. So if Rand were to take out the Forsaken, and, Elaine would then have to choose between her mom and her cutie pie boyfriend. Oof, that's rough.
I was about to say, I think the way you were originally analyzing that, the her who is angry would be Morgaze, I wanted to point out, given that we are playing with deep time, it feels just as likely that that might be Elaine, who is the her that would be upset if Andor is involved in this in any way. Good catch. Perrin, lounging with Aiel on his lap, kissing her while she played with the shortcut beard he wore in the dream. Behind them were two banners, a red wolf's head and a crimson eagle. A man in a bright yellow coat stood near Perrin's shoulder, a sword strapped to his back. In some way she knew he was a tinker, though no tinker would ever touch a sword, and every bit of it except the beard seemed important.
That, to me, my question when I read that flash was like, is that it for Perrin in this book? Like, because that seems like this moment, right? That's them off on their honeymoon with maybe the Tinkerer along for protection.
Yep.
And like, boy, that could be it. And we just know they're off having a good time, eating grapes and resting their heads on each other's bellies.
That is it. Congrats.
Within that, I liked the joke about the beard because, as I recall at the end of the last book, Aiel did not like the beard. And what is marriage except bending to fit your partner's desires a little bit, but maybe not giving in all the way?
Yeah,
what do you have to say to that, Tylor, with the short trim beard?
I went through exactly the same process that Perrin did, being told for years and years I should never grow a beard, and then during COVID growing one and being told I'm never allowed to shave my beard. So I can relate to Perrin quite a bit. The last of our visions is, actually not the last. Matt throwing dice with blood streaming down his face, the wide brim of his hat pulled low so she could not see his wound, while Tom Marilyn put his hand into a fire to draw out the small blue stone that dangles on Moraine's forehead.
I mean, the second part of that is pretty scary, right? Like, could we be seeing the end of Moraine? I think this is something we've said seems to be, foretold in moments. She's preparing for her end or her distance from Rand. And just as classical Joseph Campbell mentor figure, we would expect her to leave the picture. Even her upcoming comment that there's a price they're willing to pay for the actions seems like that's preparing us for that. The Matt with the dice just feels like he has no wound. He's just, it's dealing the cost of continuing to use this luck, which has made us nervous for some time.
The only thing I will add to that analysis, I think you hit pretty much all of it, is do note we have seen multiple visions of Matt either losing an eye or placing an eye on a scale, so bleeding from the face in a place that's blocked by a hat may very well be one of his eyes is what is bleeding.
Oh, Aes Sedai. I just got that. Go ahead.
Heyo. Those are all of the visions. I don't think we have too much more to dig into there. I just need to make sure that Greg hears them twice because I know he skimmed them the first time.
Fair.
The next moment that really stood out to me is we get a very brief conversation between Rand and Jason Natale that Egwene peeks in on. Nothing seems to be happening, but then when Egwene goes to Moraine's tent, Moraine is eavesdropping on Rand and Natale. And this is very interesting to me because it seems that Rand is unaware of that eavesdropping. And what that means is that he may be talking to what we know is Asmodean and not realize that Moraine is hearing him, for example, call that person Asmodean. So this really raises questions for me about what does Moraine know about all the things that Rand thinks are secret from her.
Yeah, I mean, I picked up on that. I'm going to give myself credit for that. And I think, the earlier comment from Avienda, I believe, who says, like, yeah, they talk and I'm not allowed to hear it. Nobody's allowed to hear it. And so we get this sense that Rand is probably dealing his greatest secrets or talking openly with Asmodean. So then the fact that Moraine might be in on that continues, in my mind, to continue the debate of who's winning three-dimensional chess here. Is it Moraine or is it Rand? It seems like 50-50 at this point.
The very simple question that I have in my brain is just why in the world hasn't Moraine killed Asmodean yet, right? She is aware that there is a Forsaken in their camp, and she must be desperate to be willing to let him continue to teach Rand. The only other real thought I had on this section is Moraine's reaction to Siwan being deposed is really fascinating, right? She says she has no time for tears. She says that she's put 21 years into this secret quest, and then she basically says sometimes you just pay the price for the things that are important in your life. And I thought that was a really telling response from a woman who probably cannot say, I don't care, this doesn't matter, I'm not sad because of the oaths. But we don't entirely know in the books how close she was to Siwan, right? This is much more fleshed out in the television show, but the books do not have even a hint of a close relationship other than the fact that they were in a very kind of tight conspiracy for a long period of time.
I was in a couple of tight conspiracies in college. It was a little rough. No, I found myself similarly thinking of the television show and putting that emotion into the scene. And, I think the relationship there, to me at least, you might know more than I do, but it's kind of in question because it felt like in some ways the show did that because it was implied here at a time you couldn't come out and say these characters were in a loving relationship. Or it would have been, the whole series would have been kind of branded as that, perhaps. Whereas in the show, it's obviously, much more open and acceptable that those women could be a couple.
Somehow,
I think
even though we're talking about the deep past, I just want to note I can't say anything about this for like 6 more books.
I will also say it felt to me like the scene reads either way. And that to me would be the brilliant way to do it at a time when you can't have an open lesbian power couple in your fantasy novels. Just write it so that it can be true. Controversy noted, we absolutely don't like J.K. Rowling and her recent comments. But the fact when she came out and was like, oh, by the way, Dumbledore was gay, and it didn't matter because it didn't come up in the books, right? But that there are problematic parts of that too. It's not as simple and clean in that. But I kind of loved it in that moment because it was like, yeah, the guy you love so much is gay, and it just, he's not dating in the book, so it didn't come up, right, as a part of that. So
I had a very different position on that. We don't need to fight about what J.K. Rowling said that's wrong, but I have a real problem with her being like, oh, by the way, gay representation was there. You just didn't see it represented.
It's very much the Will on TV who's gay, but you don't actually get to see him be gay, like, period. Yeah. I don't think he kisses more than like 5 men in that show. And so I accept that as well. And I'm certainly not here to say like civil rights was mastered in that moment, but it does feel like, there was a level of representation that we had to get through to now be at the let's give meaningful, full-throated embodiment to people of those orientations and every orientation. So in that scene, I then found myself really latching on to that phrase, right? That there's always a price to be paid, and just make sure what you do is worth the price. I mean, that isn't my icebreaker this year for the first day of classes was everybody share the best piece of advice you've ever been given. That's not a bad one, right? Like, to make sure your actions are worth the price you'll pay someday for them. Seems like something I could tell a bunch of first years.
So this is actually the line that stuck with me at the very end of the chapter, right? Egwene notices that Moraine treated her as an equal, and then she thinks, I might be closer to choosing my Aja than I thought. And I think one reading of that line is just like, I'm close to being an Aes Sedai, and so that means I will get to choose my Aja. But I wonder whether that line is also indicating that Egwene has made some sort of decision about which Aja she is going to choose or which Aja she won't choose. And the line you were just highlighting, sometimes you just pay the price. I'm wondering if Egwene is thinking maybe the blue isn't for me because the kind of price that Moraine is saying you have to pay might not be for her.
I feel like there have been a lot of hints that she's not going blue. But blue continues to feel to me like Gryffindor, to continue talking Harry Potter, where it's like, why would you not be Gryffindor, right? Like everybody awesome's Gryffindor.
Because Hufflepuff is rad. Don't act like there's only one good house.
You softies. Yeah. So I do feel like there's a way in which I would expect Egwene to default to blue. So part of it is like, wow, she's so noble and is willing to make that sacrifice. I want to live up to those values. I could see making that case, even though
Yeah.
my heart tells me because of the previous hints, it's more the latter, which is, or more the former, what you said, which is, I don't think that's the life for me.
Yeah, I think we have talked about this as much as we can talk about it without me telling you what Aja she will eventually pick potentially someday. Chapter
Tell me,
16,
like, how
An
many
Unexpected
books
Offer.
are we from that? How many books are we? Nope, I'm not.
Oh, God.
We have a delay today that is making me interrupt you a lot. So sorry to listeners that makes angry. How many books?
I can't say that without it being a pretty significant spoiler.
All right. Chapter 16, An Unexpected Offer. Fine.
Yeah, that was a really bad question. Most of them I'll give you a vague-ass answer, but that one, the answer tells you a lot of things. An Unexpected Offer. Nynaeve wakes after her bad dreams of both Elida and Egwene. Nynaeve has scratches from the dream, and she lied to Elaine about the source of them, saying it was just brambles. Elaine wants to apparently take a boat to Ibudar so they can quickly get to Tyr, which they decide is the best destination for them, but Nynaeve worries both that a ship won't stop, and also that they might miss signs of where the Blue Aja are gathering, and we learn that Nynaeve would rather travel overland because while it will take longer, it will also allow them to pick up any signs of what is going on, but she also kind of admits to herself she mostly just doesn't want to have to deal with seasickness and the other problems associated with traveling by boat. Elaine tells the innkeeper that they intend to keep... they tell the... I'm sorry, I skipped a line. Nynaeve wants to travel overland, and she apparently still does not remember where the Blue Aja are. At this point, Elaine tells the innkeeper that they don't need a private room for their dining. They want to stay out eating with the rest of the people. And we also learn that strawberries are so uncommon that Nynaeve doesn't know that they exist. I'm not sure that was important, but it was fun, so I'll mention it here. Suddenly, Galad is there, and he has recognized Elaine despite the fact that she has dyed her hair. He is now a white cloak and apparently relatively highly ranked, and says that it was the right thing to do to join the white cloaks, and that's why he did it. He says that Elaine should not be involved with any Aes Sedai plots, and joining the white cloaks was the easiest way to make that clear and also to advance his goals. We learn that he is already a leader in the white cloaks, and she tells him that Morghese knows where she is because she sent a letter, but he immediately cuts her off, saying that she should never mention the tower or her mother while they are around white cloaks. He asks after Egwene and notes that Gawain was very worried about her, and he was also worried about her. Apparently Gawain remains in the north and did not travel with Galad. He tells them the details of what happened in Tar Valon, in particular that there was an uprising and that the tower has split, and he offers to escort them to Caemlyn. Elaine says that they need time to think, and at this point another white cloak approaches, asking Galad to introduce the pretty girls, and he lies about knowing them, and Elaine quickly uses that as an excuse to rush off to her room after she tells the innkeeper to have Tom and Julin sent up. Elaine says that they need to leave immediately, and when Nynaeve seems suspicious of this, she says that Galad might turn them in at any point because there are two things that he believes are true, both that he should follow the rules of the White Cloaks and that he should protect Elaine, and at any point he could decide that one of them is more important than the other. Elaine also insists that he is only her half-brother, and she denies that he is her brother at all and doesn't accept that relationship. She says that he will do right no matter who it hurts, but he is the one who decides what he thinks is right. Elaine then tells Tom and Julin what is going on, and Tom clearly remembers Galad and is similarly worried as Elaine was, and then Tom realizes that Elaine remembers him and notes this, and Elaine says that she didn't remember until Tanchico, but she does now, and then tugs at his mustache. At this point, they realize that the carriage they've been riding in is very noticeable, and Galad will know wherever it goes, but there are very few other escape options. Tom thinks that Pedron Nial means to absorb a significant amount of territory, and he even says the word Saladar, and somehow Nynaeve doesn't recognize it and still doesn't know where they are going. At this point, Nynaeve suggests that they could travel with the circus, because that would be more or less unnoticeable, and it wouldn't be what Galad is looking for. And at this point, Elaine seems excited that they would be able to go to Ghealdan, because that would be a direction not expected. This is something Nynaeve did not think of even a little bit, but she claims it was the first idea that she had, proving she actually didn't learn much from her conversation with Egwene. At this point, they book the room for another day and acquire bonnets to hide their faces. At this point, Nynaeve asks Elaine about Tom, and Elaine tells her all of the details about their past, and then Nynaeve gives her explanation for what is going on with Elaine's behavior that seems to be based on the idea that single women always want to go after the same man as their mother, which doesn't seem accurate. Nynaeve then tries to call Tom a second father to Elaine, but she dismisses that and doesn't seem to know exactly where Tom fits in her life. Nynaeve tries to kind of talk about how old he is, but Elaine notes that if he didn't have a limp, he would still be in extremely good health. And then Elaine switches the subject to Galad, and Elaine is certain that they must flee town immediately, and they make plans to do so. So this is a chapter that features a character who you have repeatedly told me to stop trying to make him happen. How did you feel about this one?
First line of my notes, stop trying to make hot Galad happen. Because the whole point seems to be like, man, this guy's eye candy. Just some grade A beefcake in a white cloak. And I don't know. It seemed very silly.
I'll be totally honest. This is the chapter where I still do not care even a little bit about Galad, but Galad has at least acquired one trait that makes me interested in reading about him in the future, right? Prior to this, who is Galad? He is a boy who is perfect looking and perfect at the sword and perfect in his behavior and only does the right thing all of the time. And after that, he is all of those things and allied with one of the most evil groups in the world. And that second character is vastly more interesting than the first. He still does nothing useful in this chapter, but someday there might be a conflict that is worth reading about relating to this character, and I'm a little excited about that at least.
Yeah, I will say the moment towards the end where Elaine points out that, you know, he is now torn between two sets of loyalties, both of which demand their capture and return to somebody. That was the moment I was like, yep, that's interesting now. And yet we still left Gawain like, yep, and also he still exists. But you're right, and you know, as much as I tease about this, it's because like these haven't been focused characters. They are usually just like banging sticks in a courtyard while the more interesting characters walk past. So that's a little hopeful to me. And I kind of liked it as a let's motivate these characters, let's set a ticking clock so they have to move and give them a threat. And we get how we get the circus back in the picture. Not that I'm skipping right to the end, but you know, that was one of the questions we had both times we recorded last week's episode.
So I think this is a chapter where it doesn't really make sense necessarily to take it chronologically, because everything that happens in this chapter is literally a rehash of what happened in the previous chapter, right? Galad gives them all of the information that they just got. And so I think the way to tackle this is character by character. And the first one I want to talk about is Galad, who we mostly have covered. He's boring, but there was one moment about him that stood out before we move on to the girls where I think the real interest is. And this was the moment where Galad... I just lost my place in my notes. I am the worst at this tonight. It is the moment where Galad... when he is talking about Egwene, there is a moment where he says that Gawain was distraught and kind of like could not be controlled. And then it's very clear that Galad almost has like a rivalry with Gawain about which of them it likes or enjoys Egwene more, but has almost like ceded that to Gawain. I don't know whether that kind of dynamic of multiple men in the same family being interested in Egwene matters at all, but it was a moment that stood out in the way he described it. It felt very different from a lot of the other things he said.
Well, it reminded me, like, in middle school when my nerd friends and I would have a sleepover and we'd all talk about, like, oh, which girls do you like? And it'd be, like, the most popular, most beautiful girls in the class, as if we at all had a shot with them. Yeah. It's like, if that's who you're into, then I'll back off. And, you know, I don't think that's quite the fair analogy, given that all of this is about how hot Galad is and how he could have any woman, it seems, in the world. But but it did feel a little bit like, oh, these are just some gross boys talking about the girls they want to marry slash kiss slash whatever with no
Yeah.
chance at doing it. So I remain there in that I'm not convinced Egwene has any interest in either of them.
That's fair.
So it's just still gross boys, even if they're attractive gross boys.
The other moment I really liked with Galad is when the other White Cloak approaches and kind of asks about the girls. Galad gives what I think in any other context we would describe as an Aes Sedai answer, where he says something like, oh, I didn't recognize them. I thought I knew who they were. There's, from far away or something like that. And that moment of him doing exactly the same thing as the organization that he says is distrustful and you should never put any stock in, I found to be like a really delicious moment of irony.
Yeah, and what fun is left is kind of between these groups and just that kind of irony, as we kind of clear off a lot of the kind of things characters don't know. I thought it was fun to still have one dangling out there.
Yeah. What did you think about Nynaeve and Elaine in this chapter? Nynaeve doesn't get a ton to do, despite the fact that it's her POV. And so I'm kind of left wondering, like, how is Nynaeve interacting with Elaine? Because there are moments in this chapter where she goes back to all of the things that I think she could have learned the lesson from Egwene, right? She lies to Elaine about how she got her scratches. She's very clearly like trying to push and manipulate and prod Elaine rather than letting her do her own thing. It feels like there's no advancement in that character from last chapter, and that's a little frustrating. I think I had kind of hoped for a moment of growth from her.
Well, it's funny how you phrase that, because I was kind of thinking back to the dynamic they'd had before going into Teleron Riode, which was so much Nynaeve acting petulantly. So I would say I was like glad she dropped all that and was, if I had to describe the two of them, they were all action. And I think it is because we get this larger threat. We get the clarity of the situation with Suan. We get this threat of Galad, and it's like, okay, let's work together and leave some of that childish stuff behind. I agree with how you just framed it, that she didn't go as far as perhaps she needed to really kind of repair this relationship and set them on a good course. But it did feel like, the two of them are better than the two of them were the last time they were talking.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a good point, right? I'm maybe wanting Nynaeve to make a big leap forward, and instead we got like a little baby step. But Nynaeve moved forward. We should probably be very happy about this. Your hair has gotten more and more ridiculous the longer this has gotten on, but it's very pixelated, so it's hard for me to see. I just need the audience to be aware of this. The last character who really gets a lot to do here is Elaine, and I identified two interesting moments here, both of them her shouting that someone is not her family member. Right? The two interesting moments for me were Galad is not my brother and Tom is not my father. If those are the two defining statements of this chapter, one of them is a yay and the other one is a huh? So what did you think about Elaine here?
Yeah, well, the Elaine Tom continues to be a head scratcher to me, because the last time we were in Elaine's head, we really played up how attracted she was to him. And I accept your read on that from our previous episode, which is that she's so kind of naive that she can't quite like determine the difference between like affection of any kind and romantic love. But to be so dead set against that, and I mean, you told me from the outset that Tom is not her father, or that it's only a theory, not ever confirmed. But like, it really felt to me like she's so quick to dismiss it. I wanted to be like, I think there's a chance there, right? You're saying like, I barely remember him, but I'm deadly certain he was not around before this time I remember it. It's like, I don't know if that checks out, and certainly would be an easy opening to make that a plot.
I do at this point want to just take a real quick moment to remind ourselves of the Andorran royal family tree, because this is a partial description of what's going on here, but there are a couple of details that Elaine doesn't know or isn't thinking that I think to fill it in and get the full picture is worth doing at least once a book, right? So we learn that Elaine is Galad's half-brother. This is because before Elaine's mother and father were together, Elaine's father was with the previous queen. I forget what her name was, but they had a couple of children together. One of them was Tigraine, who vanished, and the other was Luke, who also vanished and now seemingly has reappeared in the Two Rivers. When that queen passed, there was a succession crisis because the heir had left, and so Elaine's father then married Elaine's mother to solidify the throne, therefore having two children, Elaine and Gawain, and allowing a half-brother with her father, Galad. Now, it's worth noting, Morgase and Elaine's father were together for some time until, and this has been heavily implied, Tom murdered Elaine's father because he was planning to kill Morgase to take control of her throne and Cairhien. So it's worth noting, Elaine is aware now of what she thinks is the full story, that Tom was the court bard and was her mother's lover. What she is not aware of is that her father was likely killed by this substitute father figure.
I knew all of that. Why are you even bothering to say it? There's not a single bit of that I didn't know and was reciting. No, very helpful, and that it was striking to me. I think what's important is to remember it's not purely matrilineal or patrilineal, that it is kind of the mix of the two families and so on. Because I immediately said, well, how is the half-brother through the father going to be the son of the queen? And that's no judgment on mixed families, I hope is quite clear, but it's more like just it doesn't follow a convenient set of rules that we're accustomed to in fantasy.
Yeah, exactly, right? And I think that the story here is that is a really messy family tree, and we need to be keeping an eye on it, because I don't want to say when, but it's going to get messier, y'all. Get ready for it. That's what I've got on that note. I don't need to say anything else about Tom and Elaine other than to say I think Nynaeve is wrong. Like, I think her explanation of just, well, young women always want to sleep with their father. Like, no. Incorrect, Nynaeve. Get a better theory. Any last thoughts on this chapter before we say the name of our podcast?
Well, you're reminding me, I always liked when somebody presses the creators of the Back to the Future trilogy, why Leah Thompson is all the moms like throughout the history of that family, because it doesn't make sense. And like somebody that the explanation they always give is like, oh, well, kids are usually attracted to somebody who looks like their mother, so like it works. And the real answer is they just wanted to put Leah Thompson in all those movies because she was fun and was a part of the family. But it does remind me of exactly that kind of hand wavy thing. Yeah. So that's all I have for real to say. And I can't name the chapters for next week because I forgot to ask you whether we're doing 2 or 3. So you can enlighten me and the audience at the same time.
We are doing 2 chapters next week, Greg. It would be 3, except the 3rd chapter is just a massive big boy that's going to dominate the following week. Next week, we will be talking about Chapter 17, Heading West, and Chapter 18, A Hound of Darkness. And we're going to get some exciting stuff, mostly because Cthulhu Elephant is back in the next chapter. So, Greg, we might be headed to a circus. What are you looking forward to as we head? I'm not going to say the name of the podcast. That's your job.
That was my elephant. I'm looking forward to that and more animal impressions through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, Amazon, or our wives. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, find us on Instagram or Threads by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being a part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe, leave us a review wherever you are listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time on Through the Glass Columns.